women's work, has been devalued for a long time. In fact, I think it's kind of ignored to a large extent. I often think about the fact that the history books that I learned from when I was in school barely included, domestic life. There would be like a little sidebar, maybe like Betsy Ross supposedly making the flag. And maybe there would be somebody spinning, like one paragraph. But I actually was just so interested in, like, it really came together for me with knitting, and then some interest I had in antique quilts, and just learning about the women's lives and the role that textile making played in their lives, and why they used the materials they used, and why they incorporated the patterns that they used, and why they used a certain kind of yarn, which would lead you to other subjects, like what kind of landscape was it, what kind of weather did they have. Like, it's no surprise that in Russia they would have a lace making tradition where the patterns look like snowflakes, and someplace else they would have something else because that's what they saw. Or maybe there might have been like a war, and there were explorers came and they brought different types of animals and fiber, or different kinds of dyes, and so you could really just use knitting or quilting or all other forms of making or domestic tasks, and learn so much about the people, and learn the stories that I was able to learn stories that I wasn't taught in school.
And do you think, as we outsource so much in society now, that we've kind of lost that understanding about the origins of things and how they're made?
Yeah, I do think. Well, if you don't see how things are made, if they just magically appear in a box on your doorstep, you have no idea how it's made, who makes it, what the effect it has on the environment, how long it takes. So I think the more that we are exposed to the making process, whether that's by observing it or participating in it, the better off we are, and the more empathy we develop for the conditions under which things are made.
And can you tell us a little about how your making plays a role in your wardrobe now?
It plays a really important role in my life now, in my wardrobe, and my sense of self. I find that the more I am able to make things myself that I want to wear, the better I feel about myself, about my creativity, about my confidence, about my persistence, my ability to take on a challenge, and sort of learn and have the sort of ups and downs of the creative process, and then to end up with something that I wear. When I wear it, I feel an inner contentment, and I think contentment or happiness is very flattering. So I feel better inside, and I think I look better outside.
You feel making is good for your mental health and your sense of well-being?
Making is crucial to my mental health. I see it as a pathway to emotional wellness for me, and I think for a lot of people. Um, I can't imagine I don't like imagining my life without it.
And what about social well-being and connection to community as well?
Absolutely. Most of my friends are makers. A lot of the travel that I do revolves around making. It's such a wonderful way to explore a place by way of the making that's happening there, or the making that happened in the past, and connecting with people. I feel like I can, if I go anywhere I go, like if I meet another maker, I might be like knitting, and then somebody will talk to me, or I might go into a pottery studio and talk to somebody who's making pottery, and we'll have something in common. So you meet all sorts of people, and I feel like I don't know, I think all my best friends, closest friends are makers.
And you've actually made a book called Making a Life. Can you give us an overview of the kind of stages that covers in the making?
So in Making a Life, I was really exploring why we continue to make by hand in our culture today, and why we continue to make the ordinary extraordinary. So we don't just make things that are functional, we make things that are beautiful. And so I traveled and spoke with makers all over the world, actually. And I divided the book into 5 chapters based on what we stand to gain from making by hand. First one is slowing down. So we obviously, when you are making by hand, you're almost always doing something at a slower pace than you might be doing a lot of other things in your life. That's just natural. And when we're able to slow down, we're able to sort of figure out, we're able to think clearly and maybe daydream and maybe problem solve, or maybe just relax. Actually, that's the second chapter. The first chapter is remembering. So we remember our heritage, we remember what came before us, we remember what it feels like to play, we remember what it feels like to do things without an expectation of perfection, which I think comes with adulthood, or certainly growing up. So that's really important. So we have remembering, slowing down, joining hands, and that's about community, joining hands with the people. It could be people near, it could be people far, sort of not like, I think it's just a way of being connected to one another, connected to our ancestors, connected to fellow makers, and that could be people like me who are doing it for my emotional well-being, and even, connecting to a certain extent with people who are doing it for their financial well-being, in terms of developing empathy for the process that they're going through, and what that would be like if you weren't just making a sweater for your own pleasure, but you were making like 100 sleeves that were going to be picked up by a truck and brought to another location where somebody else is making, the fronts or the backs or the bodies of the sweater. And then we have the next chapter is making a home. So we can feel sort of comfortable in our own skin. We can make a nest for ourselves. We can personalize our home. We can, I think it's when our homes reflect the lives that we lead and who we are, they generally feel warm and joyful because we imbue it with our creativity and our memories and our aspirations. And then the final chapter is finding a voice, and that is, through our making, we express who we are to the world, and we actually figure out who we are and perhaps why we're here and what our purpose is.
So you think that everyone should be making?
I personally do. I think creative expression is absolutely crucial to human thriving. So there's obviously lots of forms of creative expression. I don't think learning to make by hand could hurt anyone. I think we stand to gain. And probably most important in that is really like the empathy part of it, especially when you're talking about clothing, learning where fibers come. When you become a maker, you become really interested in, let's say you're knitting with wool or sewing with linen, and then you start to find like, oh, these things come from the earth, and like how we care for the earth affects the health of these fibers. And then if we're using dyes, like the chemical dyes or natural dyes, and you just become really curious about that. And then you really care about it because you are experiencing it. It's relevant to your life.
So the fact that everything's designed for us now, like it's there at the click of a button, it's having repercussions, really, isn't it, in terms of our connection to things and our level of consumption as well. We're not satisfied.
Yeah, and I think we're looking, it's sort of like the low-hanging fruit. I think sometimes we feel unwell or dissatisfied, and we look to sort of retail therapy. I'm going to buy myself a present. I'm going to find something what it becomes is like a Band-Aid, and then we need another Band-Aid. But when we learn to make things ourselves, first of all, we don't need, it takes longer. So we have the pleasure and challenge of that process. And if our result is successful, we have the pleasure of the result. So, sometimes people talk about yarn, high quality yarn being expensive. And I sometimes think, well, you have to amortize that over like the hundreds of hours that you might be spending with that yarn, and the pleasure of that time, and also the fact that you're not out shopping and consuming during the making process.
What if it's not successful, though? You mentioned there. Have you had failures, and how do you redeem them?
Oh, I've definitely had unsuccessful projects, and that's always tricky. Um, what I have come to learn better and like to share with people is that we don't have to be like great at sewing or quilting or pottery. In fact, there's no reason why we would be really great at it if we hadn't put quite a lot of time into it, into learning. And also, how do you define great? Like, if you enjoyed the process and you like the result, sometimes that result is wonky, sometimes it's pristine. It depends on, the level of skill you have, or the level of commitment you have to the project. So I try really hard to enjoy the process, and to not expect more from myself than is realistic. And I feel like I've made lots of things that I really, really love. Things I love to wear, things I love to use. And yes, there have been things that I've made that have been unsuccessful and have made me unhappy. But in the scope of my life, I feel like handwork has been a pathway to wellness that I would never trade in for anything else.
And there's learning along the way too, isn't it? Even through the failures, you learn, or you can adapt or keep evolving them, particularly with clothes. Like, it's not done until you're happy with what's done.
Yeah, and also I find that like sometimes I get like nervous about like, oh, I'm not going to do this right, or why are the other people that say I'm taking a class, like they know how to do it and I don't, and I've asked too many questions and all those kinds of things. And that's like all in my head, and I get really self-conscious about it. And I think when we're just able to like quiet ourselves down and just to be present and just to like focus on the work in our hands, then we tend to be more successful. So it's like that psychological piece. And what I like, why do we as adults, I think we tend to specialize, and then we do the things we do well, and we get out of practice at learning. But when you do stick with it and take the time it needs to learn, and that could be, sewing the seam and ripping it out. And I, in particular, have a really hard time with machine sewing, and I'm constantly threading the machine wrong and having problems with the bobbin, and I'm like sewing the wrong seam. And when you're hand sewing, you have like a lot of time to think about it, so sometimes you realize you're making an error before you've done the whole thing. But with the machine, it like goes so fast, and the stitches are so teeny, and then it's hard to rip them out, and I can get really frustrated. And I much prefer hand sewing over machine sewing, but I'm actually doing more machine sewing now because I'm just trying to like come to terms with the tension I feel around it, and develop some confidence so that I'm not like afraid of the sewing machine, which honestly, like anytime I turn it on or plug it in or whatever, I do feel a little tension. But as I learn to sort of calm myself and just be present with it and just do what I can, and when I make a mistake, fix it, and the better I feel. And I see that patience that I'm developing with myself and with the process has rewards in other parts of my life as well.